right, we've been talking about program music. Let's take a look now at the concert overture, which is one of our types of program music. So there are two ways we can think about a concert overture. One might be that we take an overture that was written for something else, like an opera, or maybe for part of the incidental music to a play, and we just take it away from the opera or play and perform it as part of a concert. And that would be technically a concert overture. We see that often with Beethoven. He only wrote one opera, Fidelio, and it has an overture, but he was kind of dissatisfied with it. So he actually wrote, I think, 4 overtures for Fidelio, and they're all called, I think, the Leonore overtures, because that's the main character, the female character in the story. So that overture actually gets performed in concerts a lot. The opera itself almost never gets performed. So that would be one way we could think of a concert overture. But when we get to the 19th century and we're talking about program music, the concert overture has a slightly different meaning. In this case, it's still a one-movement work, just like an overture would be from an opera. But instead of connecting to some particular story you're going to see, it may tell a story that you're going to have to imagine for yourself. So that's what the programmatic part is, of course. So there are 2 basic things that they're generally used as a basis for concert overtures. One is to make a commemorative sort of storyline. So Brahms wrote a piece called Academic Festival Overture. And you think, well, what's Academic Festival? What kind of event is that? It was actually written because a university gave him an honorary degree, and they wanted him to write a piece of music that sort of commemorated that. And so he wrote this overture, which is full of references to songs that students at universities in Germany would have sung. So if you were a German college student at the time, you would recognize the tunes. So that was his contribution to the festivities, we'll say. The piece that we're going to talk about today, the 1812 Overture, is also an example of that type of work, a commemorative kind of work. The other kind of concert overture that we often see is one that has its basis in literature or in some visual art form. Liszt wrote a piece that some people call a concert overture and some call a symphonic poem, and it doesn't really matter what they call it, still a great piece of music. That was the English title is The Battle of the Huns, which was his musical interpretation of a painting by the same name. Another example, taking the literary side of it, is Dvorak's Othello. So he took Shakespeare's play Othello and wrote his musical impression of that piece in a concert overture. So as I said, we're going to talk today about the 1812 Overture, which is an extremely famous concert overture. And before I have you go listen to the entire piece, we're going to look at it segment by segment so you sort of see how the themes work together, and then you can go listen to the entire piece, which is about 18 minutes long. So this piece is by Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who is obviously a Russian composer. He wrote this piece in 1880, but the title is Overture 1812. Well, the way you used to call it the 1812 Overture. So what is he commemorating here? He's not talking about the War of 1812, which was an American thing, and he's Russian. He really didn't care much about that. But what happened in 1812 in Russia is that Napoleon invaded. So this was an important historic event in Russian history. So Napoleon came in to invade, came into Russia. Unfortunately, Napoleon wasn't smart about his timing, and he did it in the winter. And so they basically just froze and starved them out. And then the French were not necessarily defeated, but they were defeated by the Russian weather and went back home, and the Russians considered that a victory. So Tchaikovsky, about 60, 70 years later, is commemorating that. So in the piece itself, we hear different things that connect to that whole story, the idea of the battle and the war with the French. So at the beginning of the piece, which is most people don't hear very often, you usually hear the ending where you hear the finale with all the big exciting bits, opens very quietly. It's a little cello choir. So we have this little section of cellos playing, but the music that they're playing is actually a Russian hymn. And the title of that hymn is, "O God, Preserve Thy People." So you can see that would be a really good setup for a piece of music that is supposed to be about this invasion of our country. So we have this hymn, we go to church, we would sing to save us from our enemies. So go listen now just to that opening section of the 1812 Overture for this little hymn, which is going to appear again later in the piece. All right, so now you've heard the opening. The next section is just sort of a building up of tension. So, it's like they're waiting because they know Napoleon is coming. So they're waiting. You get progressively more intense, a lot more rhythmic vigor coming into it. That hymn is very solemn and not rhythmically active, we might say. So as we progress into the piece, what we hear next that's recognizable is the French national anthem, La Marseillaise. So when it's heard the first time, it sort of sounds like it's off in the distance. So you might imagine that you're the Russians and you're waiting and you can hear them coming. So listen now to this, the first time that we hear the French national anthem in 1812, and think about how Tchaikovsky makes it sound like it's perhaps a little bit distant. All right, so now we know that the French are coming. The next part that I want you to listen to is a section that sounds rather like folk music. Remember, this is the Romantic period, and lots of composers are doing nationalist kinds of things, and this is actually a good example of that as well. So Tchaikovsky incorporates some music that sounds like Russian folk song to sort of represent the people. So you might think, as you're listening to this, okay, so the French are here. This is the cold, dark Russian winter. Listen to these folk songs and see if they conjure up for you the idea of that sort of dark, cold side of Russia. Okay, so now you've heard the folk part of this. What happens next is that we hear the French national anthem again. And it starts out very much like it does the first time. But then what Tchaikovsky has done is added cannon fire. So we actually have battle happening here. Whether there was a lot of battle at the time, I'm not quite sure. But he's going to throw that in because we know this is a war between the French and the Russians. So what Tchaikovsky actually intended was cannon fire here. And lots of places, they still do it that way. Obviously, it's better if it's an outdoor concert when you do that. When I lived in Utah, I used to play in an orchestra, and every 4th of July, we would do a concert in the park, and this was our finale piece. So we would play the 1812 Overture, and there was a reenactment group that had all these different sorts of cannons, and they would set them up in a field across from where we were, and as we played the piece, when it gets to this part, they would start shooting off those cannons. And I knew it was going to happen. I mean, I played this thing for years, and I knew it was going to happen, and every time it happened, the cannons still sort of made me jump. So I want you to listen now to that section where the French national anthem happens, and the section, through the part where the cannons actually start going off. All right, so now we've had this big dramatic moment. And as we know, the Russians were victorious, however you'd like to define that in this particular battle. So what we have is a return of that opening hymn. The "Oh God, preserve thy people." So now it's more of a thanksgiving that he has preserved his people in Russia. So it's a little more energetic, perhaps, has more instruments playing than just the cellos. So listen now to how the opening hymn comes back into this piece of music. So now we have the big rousing finale. So we have this hymn tune going, we have cannons, we have church bells. If it's performed outside and you have a church nearby that actually has a carillon with bells, that's how they do it. And so the bells are ringing, the celebratory bells that the battle is over and we've won. So he incorporated all these things that were really not what you would think of as an orchestral sort of thing, but it makes a highly dramatic piece of music. So, but what happens at the very end is that Tchaikovsky brings in a new tune. He brings in what at the time of 1812 was not actually the Russian national anthem. It didn't become the national anthem until a little bit later, but God Save the Tsar, which is the same tune as God Save the Queen, which is also the same tune as My Country 'Tis of Thee. So it's a very popular tune. You have to listen sort of carefully to hear it because it's the rhythms are stretched out a little bit differently than they are in the original, and it sort of starts in the middle of the tune. So, but it's in the bottom instruments, so you can hear that the low, really powerful trombones, low strings, they've got this melodic line. So we've got God Save the Tsar playing, we've got cannons going off, we've got the little elements of the French national anthem still thrown around in there. So it's just this big dramatic ending. So I want you to go now and listen to the entire piece, which lasts almost 20 minutes. So sit back and enjoy yourself and enjoy this really highly dramatic concert overture